Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 43rd episode of In Conversation Live. I'm Roger Kirby, President of the Royal Society of Medicine, and it's a real honour this evening to present to you Sir Michael Marmot. Sir Michael was born in London in 1945. When he was a young child, his family moved to Australia, to Sydney, and he attended the boys' school there, graduating in 1968. He earned a PhD in 1975 at the University of California for research into coronary heart disease in Japanese Americans. And he's been a world leader in the study of health inequalities for over 35 years. He's just told me that he's the 49th most highly ranked author for citations of his work in the world. So, wow. He was chair of the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, which was set up by the World Health Organization in 2005. And I think that was the launch, really, of so much of his really good work. And he produced Closing the Gap in a Generation in 2008. In 2010, he produced a very influential report for Gordon Brown entitled Fair Society and Healthy Lives, the Marmot Review. And 10 years later, he's published a review of that entitled Health Equity in England, 10 years on. This year, he's published two further reports, Build Back Fairer and Sustainable Health Equity, Achieving a Net Zero in the UK. And he's told me he's just been doing a Zoom with colleagues in Egypt today to talk about equity in the Eastern Mediterranean, and we'll be talking about that. He's also served as president of the British Medical Association, and he's currently president of the British Lung Foundation. Michael, you are so welcome to our program. We're proud of these In Conversation programs. So let's start at the beginning, a bit like they do on Desert Island Discs, and your upbringing and education at the University of Sydney. I mean, do you have happy memories of your childhood in Down Under?
Oh, very happy memories. I think what I might have done had I not spent time in the street with a fruit box and a cricket bat and a cricket ball, playing cricket every afternoon after school. I might have done all sorts of other things, but it was very happy time. But there was a bit of a cultural cringe in Australia. There was a feeling that everything happened somewhere else. There was some place in heaven called the Hammersmith Hospital where they wrote textbooks that were passed down from God, I thought, or the Massachusetts General Hospital. I couldn't imagine that textbooks in medicine were written by real people because they came from so far away. So I knew at some point that I was going to leave Australia and discover what was going on outside.
Mm-hmm. And so you moved then to California, University of California, Berkeley. So, and you started work there on some looking at Japanese immigrants to California and their differential rates of stroke and heart disease. And just briefly give us a kind of flavor of that work.
Well, it was a remarkable story that if you look at men of Japanese ancestry in Japan, Hawaii, and California, as they migrate across the Pacific, the rate of heart disease goes up and the rate of stroke goes down. So if you were looking for genetic explanations of why the Japanese seem to be protected from heart disease, they lose that protection as they migrate across the Pacific. Mm-hmm. And that's was really interesting. And I was interested in culture, society. The conventional explanation is that the rate of heart disease must go up because the diet becomes more westernized. And indeed, the diet does become more westernized. But when we looked at the Japanese in California, at those whose society and upbringing was more traditionally Japanese, and those who were more acculturated, more westernized, we found that the more acculturated Japanese had higher rates of heart disease, regardless of cholesterol levels, smoking levels, blood pressure. So it wasn't just due to westernization of diet or lifestyle, it was related to society and culture.
Yes, and that was a very widely quoted study. But you then decided to leave California. Some people will be asking why you left such a nice part of the world. And you came back to London, but you came back via the Philippines. Is that right?
Yeah, it was hard to leave California. The thing that clinched it, Donald Reed, who was Professor of Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, said, we'll halve your salary. You won't have any high living. It'll be high intellectual activity, but grim living. And that was so attractive, I couldn't turn it down. But in between, I did a consultancy for the World Health Organization Western Pacific region based in Manila in the Philippines. And my mission was trying to get the Philippine Heart Center for Asia to do epidemiology, actually to be involved in cardiovascular epidemiology.
Right. Well, before we talk about London and what happened there, there's a question from David Mummery. Thank you, David. Could you comment on health inequalities in Australia between Aboriginal Australians and other people living in Australia? I spent a week or two in Darwin, where there are an awful lot of Aboriginal people, and they don't look as though they're terribly healthy. Any comments on that?
Yeah, the gap in life expectancy was alleged to be 17 years between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The official figures now are more like 10 years, 10 or 11 years, both for men and for women, so shorter life expectancy. And the striking thing is that no one's in any doubt that Australian Aboriginals live in poverty compared to the non-Indigenous population. But when you look at the causes of death that contribute to this excess mortality in Indigenous Australians, it's not infant and child mortality. It's not the usual causes we associate with poverty. It's heart disease, cancer, endocrine disorders, including obesity, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is really interesting. It's, in general, non-communicable diseases, which we know are related to the social determinants of health. And in recent years, whenever I've gone to Australia, I've made a point of visiting Indigenous communities, meeting people working on health and health care in Indigenous communities, and become something of an advocate. And the insight I was given by one person working at an Aboriginal health centre was the answer to the question when people say, we've spent billions trying to close the health gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, how come it doesn't work? And the answer I was given was, if you've spent 200 years disempowering a group of people, don't expect money by itself to solve the problem. Money is important, but so too is empowerment, control over your lives. And that's absolutely vital.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the Philippines, you came back to London, and that must have been the 1990s, was it?
I'm actually a bit older than that, 1976.
Oh, right. And then you were a researcher in public health for many years, but I think it was your connection with Donald Aitchison, the CMO at the time, that got you involved in issues of inequality in the 90s to begin with, before that WHO connection. So just tell us a little bit about how that interest in well, the life interest in inequalities came about? When did the sort of penny drop that this was the key to so many problems?
Well, when I came from Berkeley back to London in 1976, and Geoffrey Rose, working with Donald Reid at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, said to me, I know you're interested in social and cultural things. Donald and I have been doing the Whitehall study of British civil servants. We don't have very much that's social and cultural. It's really about risk factors, but we do know people's grade of employment, where they are in the hierarchy. You could look at that. So I did. And at the time, the conventional wisdom was that high status people were more likely to have heart attacks than low status. Right. Football managers, don't work so hard, you'll have a heart attack, was the conventional wisdom. And looking at the Whitehall study of British civil servants, what I found was quite remarkable. If you look at mortality from heart disease, the lower the position in the hierarchy, the higher the mortality from coronary heart disease and from a whole range of other diseases as well. And if you think that British civil servants exclude the richest people in society, no bankers, no hedge fund managers, and exclude the poorest, everyone's employed, it's not very wealthy if you're an office assistant living in London, you are finding it difficult to live, but you're not in absolute poverty. And in this group, excluding the richest, excluding the poorest, the lower you were in the hierarchy, the higher the mortality, the shorter the life expectancy. And that, which I saw, which I found, I published my first paper on it in 1978, and that's kept me exercised ever since. First, trying to explain it. What's this about? If it's not wealth and it's not poverty, it's something about inequality, what we call the social gradient. What's that about? And then it kept me exercised in policy terms. So firstly, the research question, why, how do we explain it? But secondly, what are the policy implications of the research? So that kept me going ever since. And it was really when Donald Acheson stepped down as CMO that you have to remember that, so 1978, I published my first paper on Whitehall. And 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister. I was told that social inequalities were not of interest. You'll remember the Black Report was published in 1980, well, was completed in 1980. Margaret Thatcher refused to publish it. And famously, she said, there's no such thing as society. So how can there be social inequalities if there's no society? So what I did, supported by the Medical Research Council, supported by the US National Institutes of Health, I set up the Whitehall 2 study to investigate the causes of inequalities, but it was pure research because the government wasn't the least bit interested in the findings. And then the government changed in 1997.
Tony Blair.
Today's pure research became today's applied research. The Labour government set up an inquiry under Sir Donald Acheson, and Donald invited me to be part of it. And I pushed hard that we had to consider the gradient. Health inequalities were not just about poor health for the poor. We had to consider the whole gradient.
So John Frank's asking, he says, lovely to hear you tell your whole story. When would you say you became a social epidemiologist? Would it be in that Thatcher era that you could call yourself that gave you your life work?
I never bothered much with titles of what it was called. It was initially curiosity-driven research. gosh, how do we get this social gradient? And the more I looked at it, the more I concluded that the social gradient was related to the structure of society, social causes. And there was a wonderful Canadian, Fraser Mustard, beautiful name, who I knew by reputation because he had been a researcher on platelets and antiplatelet drugs in the heart disease field. And I knew of that work. And he turned up in my office one day in London at UCL. And he said, I want to talk about the Whitehall study. And this was in the mid 1980s, about 1986, thereabouts, 87. And he said, I want to talk about the Whitehall study. This is of fundamental importance to policy, he said. Mm-hmm. I said, not in Britain, it isn't. No one's interested. He said, well, they are in Canada, and we're going to put it on the map in Canada. And he did. They were writing newspaper articles in the Canadian press about the Whitehall study. And he said, this is of fundamental importance. And he was president of the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research. And he set up this group, this population health group, and very much around the gradient and the causes of inequalities. So I don't know that I called myself a social epidemiologist, but it was the wonderful Fraser Mustard who said to me, your research has fundamental importance for society. Mm-hmm. I said, oh gosh, does it? Well, let's think some more about it.
Social gradients, it's a good expression. Of course, those gradients are getting steeper, not less steep, as we'll come on to talk. So I think the real breakthrough in getting the message out to the world came from that WHO report that you did in 2006. 7, 8, I think, before it came out. So how did that happen? Because the WHO, did they approach you to do this, Michael, or they funded this, I suppose?
Yeah, they did. Well, the background was there was a commission on macroeconomics and health. And the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health said, invest in reducing major killing diseases, HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, in order to get economic growth. Mm-hmm. And I thought, at the time, I was doing a mini sabbatical at Trinity College, Cambridge, organized by Amartya Sen, who was then the master of Trinity, Nobel Prize-winning economist and philosopher. And Jeff Sachs had published this report. And I said, Amartya, don't you think he got it upside down? We don't want to improve health in order to get a better economy. I didn't go into medicine to cure people's illness so that they could become richer. Mm-hmm. Or I didn't go into public health to try and improve population health so the society could become wealthier. It's the other way around. We want to improve society in order to get better health.
Right.
And Amartya Sen said, I agree with you. And I said, why don't we get a group together to say that? And Amartya said, yeah, sure. And then he said to me, it might be a good idea to get WHO backing.
Right.
So I went off to WHO and said, how about setting up a commission on social determinants of health? That was in December 2003.
Right.
In fact, soon after J.W. Lee, who was the Director General, took the decision, I published my first book, Status Syndrome, in 2004. And I brought J.W. Lee a copy. And he said, Status Syndrome, who's at higher risk? And I said, everybody below the 7th floor. his office being on the 7th floor of
In Geneva, this was, I
in
suppose.
Geneva.
Yeah, yeah.
The 8th floor was a reception area. Everyone below the 7th floor, and he smiled and he said, "Just like the monkeys and the apes, yeah?" And I said, "Yes." So he invited me to come to a seminar that the WHO Executive Board was holding in Reykjavik in Iceland in December. I thought, wow, it doesn't get light in Reykjavik in December. And he made copies of my book. He bought copies of Status Syndrome for all the members of the executive board. And the idea was that I should convince them that this commission was worth doing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was fun. So yeah, it came, it was a series of conversations. I don't think I would have got there without Amartya Sen saying, let's get WHO backing for this. And Amartya became a member of the commission.
So how did that commission work? How many people did you rope in to help you, and was it centered in London in your labs, or were you back and forth to Geneva to do things there?
So I thought, if you're going to have a commission like this, it needs to be regionally representative. And in my mind, regional representation meant you had professors from Yale as well as Harvard, or Oxford as well as Cambridge. That's regional representation.
Right.
Forget it, mate. That's not how WHO works.
No.
So we had commissioners, some were politicians. We had Ricardo Lagos, former president of Chile, Pascal Macumbi, former prime minister of Mozambique. We had former government ministers. We did have distinguished academics, but we had people from all over the world, from every region of WHO. And that was very much, they called for nominations. There were something like 295 nominations for a commission of 18 people. So it was a bit selective. And I was nervous. I'm chairing this thing, and I've got former presidents and prime ministers and ministers and so on around the table. And I thought, how's this going to work? I know how to have arguments with academics. I don't know how to have arguments with politicians. It was brilliant. It was terrific. They were, I don't know if it was the insight of J.W. Lee and his colleagues at Geneva that produced such a wonderful group of commissioners, but they were absolutely terrific. And about halfway through, when we got to know each other very well, and I professed my insecurity. What am I doing chairing this thing? You people, you're very important people, and I'm just a humble professor. And they said, no, it's okay, Michael. You know something about the topic. Well, it was just wonderful learning exercise. And we had two secretariats, one in Geneva at WHO and one in my office at UCL in London. So I did go backwards and forwards between Geneva and London. We worked closely with the Geneva Secretariat. We wrote the report in London, which was important. And we set up 9 knowledge networks. So we had experts from around the world on 9 topics that I thought to be important, giving us the wisdom of the global literature on social determinants of health. So it was the most amazing learning exercise for all of us. Indeed, we did a consultation exercise. We did several before we started. And one distinguished US professor said, I was involved in a previous commission where the report was really written before we met. But that won't happen this time. Michael doesn't know enough. So that was nice, but it was true. I didn't know enough. I couldn't write the report before we met. We learned together, And the report looked nothing like I imagined it would look like at the beginning.
How many pages did that report turn out to be? Can you remember? As several hundred, I guess.
It was, yeah, it was a few hundred pages.
Mm-hmm.
And the commission had 10 meetings. I remember them all as if it were yesterday in different parts of the world. And we produced a draft at our last meeting, which was in Japan. And I thought, well, we've done it. And the commissioners spent 2 days going over every single word of the draft. And the end result was we went back home and rewrote it completely. And we went backwards and forwards with commissioners, WHO people, and the like. And we put on the cover, social injustice is killing on a grand scale. We put that on the cover, which was a bit unusual for a WHO report. And I think it did have influence.
And I think it's lasted. You were telling me before we came online that somebody commented that most reports don't last very long, but this one, what did he say to you?
Well, it was a Swedish parliamentarian. So we published it in 2008. And in 2013, I was at a meeting in Stockholm. And he said, the half-life of most commission reports is 6 weeks. Your report is still being discussed in the Swedish parliament 5 years later. And he said, next time you come to Stockholm, come to the parliament. We'd like to talk to you. So I did. I was back in Stockholm a few months later, and I went to the parliament and I met the social committee. And I said to them, yesterday, I was at a meeting at SALA, the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions, something like 280 local areas represented. And I said the enthusiasm in that room for social determinants of health and health equity was quite remarkable. So I'm really pleased, I said to the parliamentarians, that you're still discussing my report. I'd be even more pleased if you did something about it. Because if you don't, at a national level, I can tell you, if every local authority in Sweden is taking action, you're going to be left behind. You'll have the whole of the Swedish population marching in one direction, and you'll have to run round to the front of the march and pretend you were leading it. Well, you've got to be patient when you're doing all this, because it was a few years later, the then Minister of Health invited me for breakfast in Stockholm. And he said, I want to tell you that I'm setting up a Swedish commission on social determinants of health. And he said, you'll know who the chair was. He didn't tell me at the time, but it was a close colleague, Olle Lundberg. And so they did set up a Swedish commission. It took a while, but it means that these things, if you try and ask the question, did report A lead to outcome B? That's a very difficult question to answer. But the Global Commission report went through some twists and turns, and finally there was a Swedish commission, which directly flowed from the global report, but quite a lot happened in between.
There's a good question from Deepesh Gopal saying, how do you stay motivated when it seems so little is changing in terms of social inequalities? I mean, maybe things are changing now. Well, COVID's made them worse, I suppose, but yeah, how do you stay motivated? You're still working terribly hard. I can tell by the way you've been in that office today, and you've been zooming around the world. We were discussing. So,
well, so I'm very much a glass half full person. So let's think about the nothing that's happened since the 2008 report. I was invited by the British government to do the Marmot Review in England, Fair Society, Healthy Lives, which we published in 2010. I was invited by the European region of WHO to chair the European Review of Social Determinants and the Health Divide. I was then invited by the American region of WHO, the Pan American Health Organization, to chair the Commission of PAHO on Equity and Health Inequalities in the Americas. And then I was invited by the Eastern Mediterranean region of WHO, mainly the Muslim countries of North Africa and the Middle East. When they invited me to do it, I said, look, I can't. They said, why not? Well, I'm busy and I don't really know anything about your region. And they said, it's an equity issue. You've done it for Euro, you've done it for PAHO, you have to do it for us. So we did. And let's come back to the English review, the 2010 review. Now, it's possible to say not much happened, which is why we published the 10 years on review, Health Equity in England, the Marmot Review 10 years on. But it's not true that nothing happened. Coventry became a Marmot city. Yep. Greater Manchester said, we'd like to be a Marmot region. Gateshead produced a new strategy based on Marmot principles. We're having local authorities all around England. I was invited to Trieste in Italy. I was told that they were having a big meeting because they were a Marmot city. And then I was invited to Bologna with the penny dropped. I said, they're not a Marmot city. No one's mentioned that name. No, of course not. We just said that to get you here. But it doesn't matter. The point is that what they were doing in Trieste, what they were doing in Bologna, was exactly similar to the kinds of actions that we were pushing. So I don't spend my time thinking, oh, look at all the governments and national entities and regions and cities that are ignoring the insights on social determinants and health equity. I spend my time saying, look at the people who are taking this seriously. And it's exciting. So the reason I stay motivated, if I thought that I was banging my head against a wall, I'd stop immediately. But we'll see what happens in Cairo and the Eastern Mediterranean. But they encouraged me. I thought that if I produced a report referring to the health equity impact of violent conflict, the problems of health equity in refugees and migrants, the problems of great gender inequity in a region, most of whose money comes from fossil fuels, say, pointing out the climate crisis, which comes from production and consumption of fossil fuels. I was allowed to say all of that in my report, which we published today. So no, I don't feel like no one's listening. I feel like people are listening all over. I could not have imagined when we did the WHO Commission in 2005 to 2008, we asked ourselves, what would success look like before we began the commission? And this is so far beyond what I dared imagine that I'm positively enthusiastic.
Yeah, good for you. I set down the 6 broad policy objectives from your 2010 report: strengthening early childhood development interventions, education, and so on and so forth. I mean, of those, which do you think would, if you could have chosen, say, 2 out of those 6 that could have come to pass, which would you say are the most important? Would it be education? Would it be health? Would it be incomes?
I very deliberately did not prioritize them. We said all 6 are vital and they're linked. So for example, take early child development. Early child development is affected by child poverty. So to say I'll only go for recommendation number 1, which is the early years, give every child the best start in life, and ignore recommendation number 4, which was about people having enough money to lead a healthy life. If people don't have enough money to lead a healthy life, their children are going to grow up in poverty. So 1 and 4 are linked.
Mm-hmm.
Number 5 was healthy and sustainable places in which to live and work. We know that over the 10 years from 2010, the proportion of people who had to pay more than 1/3 of their income on housing, on rent, that proportion went up. And of course, it follows the social gradient. The poorer the household, the more money they have to spend on rent. So rent becomes a health issue, because if you're paying a lot of money on rent, you can't afford healthy eating. Food insecurity goes up. So I deliberately didn't prioritize. All 6 are important, and we need government to deal with all 6. Don't close Sure Start children's centres. Don't increase child poverty. Don't reduce the spending on education by 8% per pupil, which is what happened after 2010. Number 3, the rise employment and working conditions, the rise of the gig economy, which is appalling. Number 4, which I've just been talking about, have enough money to lead a healthy life. Number 5, healthy and sustainable places in which to live and work, including housing. So don't say we're going to focus on education and ignore rough sleepers and other homeless people. And number 6 was taking a social determinants approach to behavior, looking at prevention in a social context. So they're all vital. I wanted action on all 6. And one of the problems of the decade from 2010 to 2020 is they pretty well all moved in the wrong direction.
And life expectancy, I think, especially in women in the Northeast, decreased. I mean, why do you think women were worse affected than men? Any thoughts about that, Michael?
Yeah, we didn't say it in my report, my February 2020 report, but talking about it after the report, what I should have said and didn't say, there was an analysis that something like 2/3 of the impact of austerity fell on women. The cuts disproportionately affected women.
Yeah.
And so you can see why it's credible that, I mean, the inequalities continue to be bigger in men than women. But that adverse trend seemed to be marginally bigger in women than men. And it may be because the effects of austerity were much bigger. And the impact for me of our idea that took root with the WHO Commission, which is that the health of a society helps you understand how well that society is doing. So in that decade from 2010 to 2019-20, when life expectancy more or less stopped improving, when inequalities got bigger, and life expectancy for the poorest people outside London went down, that tells us that society was not doing well. And it means whatever you were doing in 2010 was causing damage. The question is what? But in retrospect, well, even at the time, a lot of people said, you can't cut everything in sight and expect nothing to happen. If you cut funding to local government in a regressive way, as we pointed out in my 2020 report, for the least deprived 20% of local areas, the spending per person went down by 16%, and in the most deprived 20%, it went down by 32%. Now, if you assume all that money is being wasted, so you can cut with impunity, nothing will happen. But what a remarkable assumption. it's highly likely that not all that money was being wasted. It was being spent on green space and libraries and Sure Start children's centers and social care for older people. It wasn't all being wasted. It was being spent on good things. And if you do it, you reduce it in a regressive way, don't be surprised that there are ill effects. And that's what I think we saw, that miserable health picture that we described in February 2020.
The politics of austerity and the results of austerity, I think, weren't realized at the time. I mean, it's surprising that people didn't pick up on it. But then you've just enunciated that your second report, the 10 years on report, but then that was just before COVID came along and disrupted everything even more. So let's talk a little bit about COVID, because that's another of your most recent reports, is the impact of COVID on inequality. So could you just summarize that report?
Yeah, there was a lovely piece in the London Review of Books that suggested that sales of Albert Camus' The Plague rose in line with the rise of COVID-19. The more COVID-19 cases and deaths there were, the more people went and bought Camus' The Plague. And what this review suggested, quoting Camus, that the plague brings to the surface the reality of a corrupt society. I thought that was putting it a bit too strongly. I put it and said, the plague, COVID-19, will expose the inequalities in society and amplify them. And indeed, that's what it did. I mean, you can remember in the early days of the pandemic, they said it's the great leveler. You know, people coming back from skiing holidays were getting sick, and the Prime Minister, the Prince of Wales, and so on, the great leveler. But it was clear that that wouldn't last. And what we saw with mortality from COVID-19 was a very clear social gradient that looked almost exactly parallel to the social gradient in mortality from all causes. In other words, the more deprived the area, the higher the mortality from all causes, and the higher the mortality from COVID-19. Almost exactly parallel, which means the causes of inequalities in COVID-19 and the causes of inequalities in health more generally overlap. Now, for COVID-19, there was some excess in the bottom 3 deciles, which we think's related to frontline occupations and living in overcrowded, multi-generational households. But in general, the inequalities were stark and similar to all causes. And then, of course, you have the effect of lockdown. Closing the schools increases the educational divide. Kids from more advantaged background, their parents were doing homeschooling, they had better computer access to classes and the like. Kids from more deprived backgrounds, nowhere to work at home, parents less able to supervise homework, schools less organized, and they fell further behind. The likelihood of being in a shuttered occupation increased in a linear fashion the poorer you were. The lower your income, the greater the likelihood of being in an occupation, an industry that closed down. So we know that food insecurity went up during the pandemic. It took a footballer to point that out.
Sure.
So the pandemic exposed and amplified the inequalities in society, and then the societal response to the pandemic increased the inequalities. And that's why I called my second or third report last year, the December report, Build Back Fairer. Right. I said the status quo in February 2020, before the pandemic crashed upon us, the status quo ante was not desirable. We do not want to go back to that. We need to build back fairer. Take the pandemic and what happened as an opportunity to do things differently.
And will our Prime Minister, whose motto is "Build Back Better," isn't it? But I must admit, I like "Build Back Fairer" more. But will he listen? Do you think? Will the Conservative government, who were behind austerity, will they listen to your plea?
Well, Debbie Abrams MP asked the Prime Minister in Parliament what he was planning to do about my report. And we know that the Prime Minister is scrupulously honest and sticks to the truth, so that when he said, I admire Michael Marmot, that had to be true. He wouldn't have said it otherwise. We've worked together for a long time. That must be true. And be assured that we will implement his report as we emerge. So that was very reassuring. We'll have to see.
He's got the incentive of his red wall voters, who are all in the northeast and the northwest, and that's the area. I think the northeast is slightly worse than the northwest in terms of deprivation. The South Yorkshire area, and perhaps up to the Humber and so on. So maybe that'll be a factor.
I have talked to civil servants in the Treasury and the Cabinet Office about the implications of my report for levelling up. What they'll do with it, I don't know, but I've talked to them. So in recent weeks, so it comes back to the earlier question, no one's listening. In recent weeks, I've talked to some senior Conservatives and to civil servants, as I said, in the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. I've talked to Liberal Democrat peers, and I've talked to senior Labour politicians. So I'll talk to anybody who will take the idea of social justice and a fair distribution of health and well-being, take that idea seriously. I want everybody to be working in that direction.
Is there anything you think the medical profession, I think there are 1.5 million people working in the NHS, and of course you could argue that the difference between the UK and the US is our nationalized health services. It makes a huge difference in terms of inequality. I mean, we've got lots of problems, but America may have worse. But can the medical profession actually do anything to help, do you think? No.
Well, I have another evidence-based response to the question of don't I get disgruntled, disillusioned? How do I stay enthusiastic? The Royal College of Physicians set up a working group, an advisory group on health inequalities, and then they approached the other medical Royal Colleges. So now they had a group, a Health Inequalities Alliance of the Medical Royal Colleges and the Royal College of Nursing. Then they approached some other groups. Most of them initially began with British or with Royal, the British Lung Foundation, British Diabetic Association, the Royal College of this, that, and the other. Last time I looked, this Health Inequality Alliance of medical groups, medical and nursing groups, had 140 members.
Right.
Wow. And so then the question is, well, what can the health service, the health care service do? And I've talked about 5 things. When I was president of the British Medical Association, we produced a report on what can doctors do, and the nurses are now producing a report on what can nurses do. And we said education and training. The second, see the patient in broader perspective, which is the good practice of medicine. You don't treat homeless people and send them back onto the street. So see the patient in broader perspective. Third, the health sector as employer, and I would now generalize that and say anchor institutions, the hospital, healthcare facilities, having a positive impact on the community in which they're based. The fourth is working in partnership, and we have now social prescribing that's taken off. And the fifth is advocacy, being advocates to change things on behalf of the patients and the society that we serve. So yeah, there's a great deal that doctors, nurses, the healthcare system can do to address social determinants of health.
That's a positive message. Let's turn to climate change, because your other report, the fourth report that I've read today, I've been reading all your works today, Michael. Let's talk about climate change and net zero and so on, because they are interlinked, aren't they? Inequality and probably climate change is going to make things worse, like in the same way that COVID did, probably.
Yeah, I was invited by the government's Climate Change Committee to convene a group to look at how actions to improve health could contribute to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Because they asked me to do it, I made it not just health, but health equity, avoidable inequalities in health. And we had two clear messages. One is, don't take actions to reduce climate change and ignore inequalities. So in other words, look at the equity impact of your recommendations. So, I mean, to take an extreme example, if you make road pricing high enough, then people can drive around in their Mercedes and Rolls Royces with the hoi polloi off the roads. Or if you have to drive, you just have to pay more and you get poorer. Mm-hmm. So road pricing might be a very good way to deal with climate change, but look at the equity impact of it. Don't just do it without regard to equity. So that's one message. The second message is a lot of the actions that we were suggesting would have the double benefit of dealing with the climate crisis and improving equity. So making transport more sustainable, making it safer to walk and cycle, subsidizing public transport is good for the planet. It reduces air pollution, and air pollution is a contributor to inequalities in health. Mm-hmm. So it has positive equity impact and health equity impact, as well as being good for the planet. And given how important both of these issues are, the climate crisis and inequalities, and both require reorganizing society in fairly fundamental ways, let's do it at the same time. That's why we called our report Sustainable Health Equity.
Yeah, it's a fantastic read. So I'd really recommend that to our viewers, our listeners. Let's give the British Lung Foundation a bit of a plug, because you've been president for a while, and there's been a merger with Asthma UK, I think, which has given it impetus, I'm sure. We had a RSM program on climate change that Professor Luxem has been organizing for us at the RSM. And we had some speakers from India yesterday who were saying that during the COVID lockdown in Delhi, for the first time, they were able to see not just the Himalayas, but the first time they were able to see the sky. The blue sky had been masked by pollution for children for all their young lives. So the air pollution is a massive issue, isn't it? I mean, of course, there's so many other issues, but as a global health issue, would you agree that it's one of the major things we have to deal with?
Yeah, air pollution is a classic example of how we have to look at inequities between countries and inequities within countries at the same time. In a rich country like Britain, the more deprived the area, the worse the environmental quality. We know if you look at schools in London, schools in deprived areas have higher levels of air pollution than schools in non-deprived areas. And you think that's appalling. Not only are our children being affected by growing up in a more deprived area, their lungs are being damaged because the schools are surrounded by high levels of air pollution. So there, in our gross inequities, within society, and then between societies. If you really want to see air pollution, go to Delhi, go to Mexico City, go to cities in low and middle income countries, and you see it. Now, the WHO has estimated that there are something like 7 million deaths annually attributable to air pollution, half indoor air pollution and half ambient air pollution, outdoor. The indoor relates to cook stoves, primitive cooking in low and middle income countries, and making environmentally friendly cooking stoves available is a very potentially positive contribution. But half of it is outdoor pollution. As you said, in Delhi, I was in Delhi in January 2020 before lockdown. And from my hotel window, I couldn't see the sky. And as we were discussing before we came online, around the time of my visit, not while I was there, the pollution was so bad that they did two things. They cancelled a cricket match. Now you can imagine how bad the pollution has to be to cancel a cricket match in India. They couldn't see the ball. And it was so bad that they told people to stay home. Now, having just been to Delhi and seen the number of people who were sleeping on the streets, I thought, if you're told to stay home and home is the street, what do you do? And it comes back to your earlier question of which one would I address first? And I said, I'd address them all at the same time. I want to make sure people had housing, and I'd want to be addressing the levels of air pollution in a city like Delhi.
Last question, because we're running out of time. We've said that there hasn't been enough progress in the last decade in the UK in terms of fixing inequalities in Britain, but on a global scale, the last decade, the 2010 to 2020, have global inequalities diminished, or have they got worse?
Again, we need to look within and between countries. The global inequalities between countries have improved. If you look at the improvement in general in the African region in under 5 mortality, the gap between the African region and other regions has diminished. So the inequalities between countries have got less. And where we've just done our report in the Eastern Mediterranean region, the improvement in under 5 mortality in many countries has been very welcome, really encouraging, just terrific. So there are exceptions, countries that have slipped back and doing badly. And we see in the Eastern Mediterranean region the impact of conflict. Life expectancy got worse in Syria, not just because of deaths and conflict, but because of the incredible disruption of people's lives. So conflict can have an adverse impact on health. Within countries, what we've seen in Britain, regrettably, is not unique. Many countries have had an increase in inequalities within countries. The social gradients got steeper, not everywhere, but in many countries. So that means continued challenge. But if everything was going to hell, that would be ghastly. It isn't all going to hell. As I said, the between country inequalities in health in general have got smaller over the last decade.
Well, that's a positive message to end on. So thank you so much. Apologies to the 73 people that sent in questions. No way that I was going to be able to answer those. And you're such a fluent speaker, Michael. I thought it was good to let you just tell your story. Your story will go on YouTube as of tomorrow or maybe the day after. So if people have missed it or want to watch it again, then they should be able to do so. Don't go away, Michael. I've got a few announcements to make. We're very proud of the other work that we do at the RSM. The In Conversation series is very popular, but we do our COVID series tomorrow, and actually we've got the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, answering questions to Simon Wesley, the immediate past president, is back. And then Simon Wesley is appearing on Desert Island Discs, so don't forget to watch that on Friday at 9 o'clock. Next week, we've got another In Conversation with Lady Susan Hayward, Jeremy Hayward's wife, who wrote a book, What Would Jeremy Think?, which is a really interesting book, and that should be fun. Helen Menage will be doing the interviewing. And then on Thursday, we'll be talking to 3 people from Europe about COVID, one from Germany, one from Italy, and one from France, where the situation, unfortunately, does seem to be deteriorating fast. So the last thing to say is that, of course, the RSM is struggling for cash like so many institutions, organizations. We've got a £4.5 million loss this year because we can't use our hotel, our restaurant, our bar, or our conference facilities. So if anybody out there is feeling generous and would like to help us at the RSM continue with our program of education and supporting innovation in medicine, please do send in a contribution. Michael, it's been such an honor to speak to you. I mean, your life work has just been absolutely astounding, and I feel really humbled, but also honored to have had the chance to speak to you. So good night, Michael. Good night, everybody. And thank you so much for your contributions. Bye.
Been my pleasure. Thank you.